This video will show you how to install fork seals on a modern motocross bike. Be sure to reference your service manual for specific instructions and specifications. You will need to remove your handlebars. This may require removing additional components such as number plates or headlights. Note the original position of your handlebar and clamps before removing them. This will allow you to retain your original bar position. Loosen the front axle nut. Support the motorcycle with a suitable stand or jack so the front wheel is off the ground. Remove the axle nut and loosen the front axle pinch bolts. Tap the axle out with a rubber mallet and remove the axle. Remove the front wheel from the forks. Because we will be removing the front forks, we will need to separate the front brake system from the fork legs. Avoid squeezing the brake lever when the disc is not between the pads. Do not allow the caliper to hang by its brake hose. When reinstalling the front brake system, make sure to tighten the fasteners to specification. Follow any other guidelines in the service manual. Record the fork's damping adjuster settings. The fork must be prepped for disassembly. Follow any specific instructions in the service manual. Usually the compression and rebound damping adjusters should be turned all the way out to the minimum setting. Thoroughly clean and inspect the outside of the fork. Note the position of the top of the fork in relation to the upper fork clamp. If you have a pneumatic fork with an air spring, the air spring pressure needs to be vented prior to disassembly. Remove the cap and vent the spring pressure with the valve. If the fork damper is to be disassembled, hold the damper with the special wrench and loosen the inner damper. Loosen the fork damper using the special tool, but wait to remove it. Loosen the fork clamp pinch bolts evenly. Support the fork legs as the bolts are loosened. Slide the fork legs down and remove them from the fork clamp. Measure and record the distance between the axle holder and the outer fork tube. Make sure this distance is the same after assembly. Inspect the fork guard wear rings for damage and wear. Replace them as necessary. Now that the fork leg has been removed, continue loosening the damper using the special tool. Support the outer fork tube and continue to loosen the damper by hand until it is free from the outer fork tube. Gently slide the outer tube down onto the lower end. Drain the fork oil into a suitable container. If the fork has multiple oil chambers, drain them as specified by the service manual. When it is time to refill the fork oil, make sure it is the correct type, fill the volume and fork height levels to specification, and follow any specific bleeding instructions in the service manual. Support the axle holder in a vise and loosen the fork center bolt. Free the center bolt from the bottom of the fork leg and extend it. If you have a steel spring fork, pull the center bolt out until the locknut is fully exposed, and use a forked stopper tool to hold the center bolt and locknut out from the bottom of the fork. Hold the center bolt locknut and loosen the center bolt from the fork damper. Remove the center bolt from the damper. Replace the center bolt, O-rings, and washers on installation. Slide out the push rod. Remove the push rod from the damper. Remove the stopper tool on the steel spring fork. Remove the fork from the vise. Support the outer tube and lift out the damper assembly. Pry the dust seal out of the outer tube with a small flat blade screwdriver. Be careful to not scratch the fork leg. Slide the dust seal down and out of the way. Remove the oil seal retaining clip with a small flat blade screwdriver. Again, take care not to damage the fork leg. Move the retaining clip down and out of the way. Use a slide hammer motion to separate the inner and outer fork tubes. The fork seals and bushings can now be replaced. Note the position of the components on the tube. Remove the inner tube bushing by gently prying it apart with a flat blade screwdriver and sliding it off the tube. Slide off the remaining bushing, the washer, the spacer if equipped, the oil seal, the dust seal, and lastly, the retaining ring. Replace the bushings if they show significant signs of wear. Clean the fork legs with aerosol brake cleaner and a lint-free cloth. Open and organize your fork seal kit. Cover the sharp bushing ridges with Teflon tape to aid seal installation without tearing them on these sharp ridges. Place a plastic bag over the end of the fork tube to protect the seals as they are slid on. Lubricate the lips of the seals and the bushings with fork oil. Install the dust seal. Make sure it goes on the correct direction. Install the retaining ring. Install the oil seal so that its dual sealing lips that sit against the inner tube will be towards the oil. Remove the plastic bag and the Teflon tape from the fork tube. Install the collar, if equipped, the washer, install the outer tube bushing, and the inner tube bushing. Make sure the inner tube bushing is fully seated. Carefully guide the components into place as you insert the inner tube into the outer fork tube. Make sure the outer tube bushing is seated. Use a fork seal driver on top of the washer and bushing to seat the outer tube bushing if necessary. Use a fork seal driver to drive in the fork oil seal until the groove for the retaining ring can be seen. Install the retaining ring. Make sure it is secure in its groove. Slide the dust seal down and fit it into place in the outer fork tube. Use a fork seal driver if necessary. Install the damper assembly into the fork leg. Install the spring with the damper on the steel spring equipped fork. The inner damper chamber should already be filled with oil according to specification. Temporarily thread the damper into the fork leg. Set the axle holder in a vise. Extend the damper so the locknut is visible. Insert the stopper tool behind the nut to keep the damper out on the spring forks. Measure the threads and make sure they are in specification. Insert the push rod. Thread on the center bolt, but leave the specified clearance between the locknut. Tighten the lock nut against the center bolt by hand until they touch. Hold the lock nut with a wrench and torque the center bolt to specification. Apply thread lock to the center bolt if required, and fit the center bolt into the fork. Tighten the center bolt to specification with a torque wrench. Support the outer fork tube and unscrew the damper. Slide the outer fork tube down so the outer damping chamber can be filled with oil. The inner damping chambers have very specific oil filling, oil level, and bleeding procedures. Consult the service manual for the specific procedures on your specific fork. Thread the damper back into the outer fork tube and tighten it by hand. Install the forks into the fork clamp. Make sure to return them to the correct height in the upper clamp. Tighten the fasteners to specification. This includes the dampers. Return the damping adjusters to their original positions. Pressurize the air springs to specification and check for leaks. Install the remaining components and tighten all fasteners to specification.